Hello and good afternoon, CSI158 students for the spring 2014 semester at Anne Arundel Community College. Today's PacketTracer tutorial is going to be on PacketTracer activity 2.2.4.10, where we're going to take a look at troubleshooting Switchport security, and we're actually going to do a little more than that. I have a Cisco 2950 switch here in the background, which we're going to be working with, and I have two MacBooks, and so we're going to go ahead and do some scenarios with port security. And before we begin, I just wanted to make everybody aware of a document that's freely available on the internet. As you can see, it's clearly unclassified. However, this is a fantastic document in terms of a starting point to gain a little bit more insight into some of the best practices, and again, a little dated. I think it's from 2004, from June 2004, but still gives you a little insight into how to secure your Cisco iOS switch. And this is from the National Security Agency here in the United States. And as you can see, if you scroll down, they talk to you about all kinds of different things. And so port security, which is on page 24, is right here. And so they give you a quick rundown on port security as well, similar to what we're seeing in Chapter 2, and gives you just a little bit better idea as to some of the practical implementations of the technology. You can see they're using a 3550 switch. So again, all you need to do is Google Cisco iOS Switch Security Configuration Guide NSA, and this document will come up. All right, so let me iconify this. So again, just another excellent reference to take a look at. So let's move this into the center of the frame here. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with PacketTracer 2.2.4.10. So an employee who normally uses PC1, which is this PC here, brought his laptop from home, disconnected PC1, and connected the laptop to the telecommunication outlet. And I think what they mean there is to the switch, connected his laptop to the switch. I'm not sure why they're calling it a telecommunication outlet. So after reminding him of the security policy that does not allow personal devices on the network, you must reconnect PC1 and re-enable the port. So here are the requirements. So let's disconnect the home laptop. So I'm going to click on that connection. We'll switch over here to the Connections tab. Alright, so I'm going to click on this connection here, and we're just simply going to, simply going to remove it. I've got some lag here. Hold on a second. There we go. Sorry about that. Some serious lag on my my virtual machine for some reason. Alright, so to remove it, I simply just highlighted it, and then I hit escape, and then that removed it. So we're going to connect back up to switch 1 here, and I'm going to actually pull the command line interface for switch 1 up, because we're going to take a look at a series of commands that are going to give us some insight into any type of security violations that we might have. So I'm in user exec mode, as evidenced by the greater than sign after the host name. Now I'm going to say enable, and that's going to put me in privilege exec mode. And from privilege exec mode, I'm going to type the show port security command. And so as you can see, we don't see anything right now. If I were to say show run interface, or let's actually do a show IP interface brief, and this is going to show us the interface. As you can see, FA01 is administratively down, right? And we have our VLAN that's up. So when PC1 was removed or reconnected to the switch port, did the port status change? So let's go ahead, and we're going to connect with a straight through cable from PC1 on the fast Ethernet 00 over to fast Ethernet 01. And actually, and so when it got connected, did the port status change? So let's take a look here. The port status did not change. So if I do the show port security again, you can see we don't see anything. What if I were to do a show port security on interface FA01? All right. So this gives us a little additional information about the status of the port to which we just connected PC1. So you can see here that the status is disabled. And why is the status disabled? Because it is secure down. And the violation mode on this port is shutdown. So if I were to say show run, you can see that it shows the port is shut down. However, what it doesn't show us here, it doesn't show us any of the configuration information for port security. And so this could be a little misleading because the port is shut down right now. It's clear that port security was on, as evidenced by the secure shutdown output that we see here from the show port security interface FA01, and the fact that the maximum number of MAC addresses is set to 1. So if port security was not on, it would not be set to 1. And it's also important to make a note here that this is the default, that by default it's going to only allow a single MAC address. So let's see if we see anything with the show MAC address table here. And so we don't see anything on the show MAC address table because that port is down. However, PC2 is plugged in. We don't see anything here either. So again, this is one of the sort of the tricky activities with PacketTracer where we would normally expect to see some output here, at least at a bare minimum, PC2's MAC address in switch 1. All right, so now the port status did not change when we reconnected, and we saw why, because the port is shut down. So it says enter the command to view the port status. Well, we did that, and the command to see the port status is show port security interface FA01. Another command that we could have run to see the status would have been show interface FA01 space status. And that is actually a command, and I'm wondering, and they don't have it here. Okay, so maybe a limitation. When we go down to the real switch, the real Cisco switch, we'll take a look at that. So for right now, we're going to be stuck with show, where are we at here? Show port security interface FA01, and that shows me that the port is disabled. It's secure down. The violation mode is shut down. And remember, we have 3 violation modes. You have protect, restrict, and shutdown. And the major difference between the 3 is that shutdown actually disables the port, as we're seeing right here. Whereas protect and restrict, they don't shut the port down. However, they will just simply drop traffic. And then between protect and restrict, remember that the difference between those two, and this is something that Cisco commonly loves to test and quiz you on, is that the difference between protect and restrict, and really the only difference, is that restrict will in fact send a notification message that a violation has occurred, whereas protect will not send a message saying that a violation has occurred. So let's slide this up a little bit here and try to get some more real estate for taking a look at switch 1. All right, so we looked at the port status. So what is the state of the port? We can clearly see it's secure down and it's disabled. So which port security command enabled this feature? Well, we would first have to turn port security on, and the way that you turn port security on, and let me go ahead and transition over here to this real Cisco switch, right? And so we're going to go ahead and go into global config mode. Into privilege exec, and I'm going to go into global config mode. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the name, and we'll just call this switch 01, right? So I actually have, if I were to do a do show MAC address table, you can see that we have a single host plugged in right now. And I'm actually going to go ahead and click on this because we're going to need these in a second. So that is just simply a little grab of the first MAC address, and that's the MAC address that we're looking at. So this is the new Mac. I just have it listed as new MacBook, right? And so this is considered the new MacBook. That's the MacBook that's plugged in, and here is that MacBook's MAC address. So it's 001 Baker, 63 Alpha Delta, and then Delta 918. It's been learned dynamically, and I'm plugged into port FA01. So if I wanted to configure port security on interface FA01, and this is really what we're being asked to do, if I pop back here, it says, which port security command enabled this feature? Well, let's go ahead and let's set up a very similar scenario. So I'm going to say interface FA0/1, and the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to say switch port mode access and switch port access, and we only have a single VLAN here, so I'm just going to say VLAN 1. So if I were to say do show run interface FA01, that's what my interface looks like right now. And the reason the switch port access VLAN 1 doesn't show up is because that's the default. And the same is true when we get into the Switchport Port-Security commands. So I'm in interface fast Ethernet 01. In order to enable port security, you have to run the Switchport Port-Security command by itself, right? If I don't run that command and hit enter, I can enter in all these other commands that I'm going to right now. They would not take effect. So let's take a look and see how this is going to work. So I'm now going to say Switchport Port-Security, and we're interested in the violation mode, right? So when I say violation, there are my three options. I can choose protect, restrict, and shut down. So by default, the port is going to shut down. And again, that's why as we look at the port over here, remember I did a do show run, oops, sorry, did a show run here. The reason we don't see anything here, right, is because for whatever reason, PacketTracer's allowing it to run and allowing the port security to run without having the proper settings. And so this can be a little misleading because without this command right here, Switchport, or I'm sorry, we'll drop back up a little higher, Switchport Port-Security, without that command, port security is not going to work, right? And so a lot of students in my classes and previous courses, this can become confusing because how is it that port security is working here when the interface is shut down? It should, even though it's shut down, I should still see the Switchport Port-Security command, and we'll see that here in a second. All right, so let's go ahead and say violation shutdown. So if for whatever reason I exceed the maximum number of MAC addresses, and right now that number by default is 1. If I wanted it to be more than 1, I would say Switchport Port-Security maximum, and then here's where I would enter in how many addresses, how many MAC addresses I would like to allow on this port. However, obviously, in my lab scenario, I have 2 MacBooks that I'm going to be using here, so we're going to leave the default at 1, and I'm going to go ahead and put 1. So when I put 1 and I say do show run interface FA01, what do we see? So I just entered in this command saying 1, however, the command does not show up here. The reason for that is because it's the default. So remember, if you only saw that command, Switchport Port-Security, with nothing else, you would know that by default, this is only going to allow 1 MAC address on the port. So now the question becomes, what type of MAC addresses, or I shouldn't say what type, but rather, how do we want to capture the MAC addresses that are going to be allowed? And so this is where we talk about the 3 different kinds of MAC addresses that you can learn. And so the first is, in terms of the secure MAC address types, the first is a static secure MAC address. So what I could say is I could say Switchport Port-Security, and you can see where it says MAC address right there. And if I do a question mark, I've got 2 choices. I can hard code the entry in, right? So I could go back up here to where I had my output, and I could grab this and say copy and paste. And when I hit enter, Oh, and it found dupe because it's got it on there already. So if you wanted to hard code it, that's how you would hard code the address onto the port. However, this is the static secure, right? So this is the static secure. The second kind is the dynamic secure. So if I were to say do show port security on interface FA01, you can see that we already have, just because we put the port security command on there, it says port security is enabled, right? Port status, it is secure and it's up. What's our violation mode? It's shutdown. Can I change the violation mode? Let's say I wanted it to be protect. So if I said protect and then we run this command again, what's our violation mode? The violation mode is protect. We want to do shutdown though, because we definitely want to have it be similar to what we're seeing above. And take a look there. Switchport Port-Security violation shutdown. We now received an error telling us that our link is down on, and actually the reason for that is it looks like my MacBook has gone to sleep. So give me a second here. Yeah, it looks like the MacBook just went to sleep, so hold on. And it's starting back up here. All right, the port changed to up. Something else we want to do is we want to do, and I should have done this right away. So in order to circumvent waiting for spanning tree to converge on that port, I'm going to turn port fast on as well to kind of speed things up. So my apologies there. I was thought I had hit the keyboard a little more recently than I had, and so the MacBook actually powered went to in sleep mode. So that's why the port went down. So again, if I run the command switchport port-security, actually do show port-security in FA01, you can see now that the mode is back to shutdown. Right? So maximum number of MAC addresses is 1. The total number of MAC addresses, so that's how many MAC addresses I've seen, and then this is the last source MAC address that we've seen, which is the same MAC address as the new MacBook, that's who's currently plugged in, right? So if I were to say do show run interface FA01, there you go. And so what we have right now is a dynamic secure MAC address, because remember, it doesn't have to be a sticky address, right? It doesn't have to be sticky, and so that's the difference between dynamic secure MAC addresses and sticky secure MAC addresses. The difference here is, take note that do we see the MAC address in the running configuration under the port? We do not. And so with dynamic secure MAC addresses, they're learned and they're only stored in the addressing table. They do not show up in the running config. And so that's what the dynamic secure MAC address is. And again, if I were to say do show MAC address table, you can see that we are now still using that same MAC address, right? The type here shows up as the static, even though it was initially dynamic, and it's still on FA01. And the reason it's static is because it has been learned, and that is the only MAC address allowed on this port, right? Because there's only one that's being allowed. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change, we're going to say switchport port-security MAC address, and we're not going to do it statically. Remember when I typed it in and we statically assigned it? Now what we're going to do is we're going to make it sticky, right? So what sticky means is when the port is plugged in, or as I enter the command in here, it's going to not only learn the MAC address, right? It'll dynamically learn it, or if it's been manually configured, it's going to store it in the addressing table. And if I do a do show run, and let's just go ahead and we'll let the do show run go here, and there we go, right? So take a look at the the additional information that we've now picked up here, and this is it. So now we are learning the MAC addresses via a sticky, secure fashion, and it includes the MAC address on the port in the running configuration, right? Okay, so here's where I'm going to go ahead and say end and write mem. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to unplug this MacBook from the switch, and I'm going to plug in this old MacBook. It's a really old MacBook I have that's great for demonstrations like this. And we're going to go ahead now, and before we do that, let's take one more look, show a MAC address table, right? So you can see that we still have the Delta 918, and we're going to change that. It should be 60 Alpha Delta when I make the switch here. And so I'm just going to reach behind myself. I'm going to unplug the first MacBook. We should get an error, or not an error message, a console message, and there it is. And now I'm going to plug the old MacBook in and take a look at what happens, right? And this is just like you see it in the text. So I plug in a different MacBook, a different PC, right? A different computer, a different device, right? And we get this port security violation error, right? The PM4 error disable on FA01. So it says putting FA01 in error disabled state. Port security 2 P-secure violation caused by MAC address 001 Baker, 63 Alpha 6, 60 Alpha Delta. And that is the old MAC address. So very similar to the activity that we're doing here, where we had, you know, this could be the old MacBook right here that was initially plugged in, caused the port to go down into an error disabled state. So let's now type in, and before when I said show port security, right? So that's what I was anticipating we were going to see. And this is a really nice output because it gives me the interface, it tells me the maximum number of secure addresses that are allowed, the current address count, how many violations have occurred, and then what the security action's going to be. So this gives you a nice little snapshot here as to what your port security setup looks like. So what if I were to say show port security interface FA01? Let's take a look at this now. So port security is enabled because we turned it on. The status, it's still secure it's still secure, but now it's secure shutdown, right? Whereas a little higher up here, if I can find it, we had port status was secure up. And that meant that we were up, everything was great. However, now, let me scroll back down to the bottom here. Now it's secure, it's not up, it is now shut down. And our violation mode is the same. The violation mode is shutdown. And again, maximum MAC addresses are 1, total max 1, sticky MAC addresses, right? 1, and this is the last source MAC address, and this is the one that has caused the problem. And again, we get a security violation count. So we've had 1 security violation. So if I were to say show port security address, right, this is very similar to the output we saw with just show port security, but what do you see? Well, it shows me the VLAN, right? It shows me the port and the VLAN, and it shows me the MAC address, that this is the address that this port is expecting. If this port does not see this address, it is going to have a violation. And how did we learn it? Secure sticky, right? That's how we learned it, secure sticky. All right, and then finally, let's take a look at show interface FA01 status. And whoops, status. And this is the command that I tried to run as well. And I like this command a lot because it gives you a very quick look at which ports that you have port security on, which of those ports may or may not be in an error disabled state. So it shows status as error disabled for FA01. If I were to configure, let's go ahead and say interface range FA02 to 24, and because it's a 24 port switch. So I'm going to say switch port mode access, and I'm going to turn port security on all of these ports. So we've taken a look at what it looks like with one port. Now let's kind of ratchet things up a little bit here. Let's also say on those ports, Switchport Port-Security maximum, well the maximum is 1, we'll say Mac sticky. So we'll turn that on all those ports as well. So let me end and we'll save our config here. And now what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and run the show interface FA01 status command again, as well as just the show port security. So if I said show port security, aha, so now we've got a little more to look at here, right? And this is sort of more of a realistic type view of when you run the show port security command, what you could be looking at. Now obviously we can trim that down. I can say show port security and just FA01. Sorry about that, we're going to leave the interface in there. Interface FA01, or you can get a holistic look at your environment with just show port security, right? So let's also take a look at that command that we wanted to see, which was show port security, I'm sorry, show interface FA01 status, right? So that's just FA01. What if I do show port security? And I didn't want that. There was one more I wanted to do. Oh, address, sorry. Show port security address, right? So the only guy who's learned something so far, and this is going to change here in a second, is FA01. However, FA01 is in a shutdown state. So now if I say show run in FA01, you can see that the first MAC address he learned, this is the only MAC address that is supposed to be plugged in there. So if I were to go into global config mode and then go into interface config mode on FA01 and say shut, no shut, to try to bring the port back up with the no shut command, look what happens. It's not going to let me bring that port back up because there is a violation there. Because again, Sticky says, I'm learning that MAC address, I'm putting it into the running config, and if I don't see that MAC address and I see somebody else's MAC address, this port is going to get shut down, and it's going to stay shut down until that MAC address is put back into the port. And again, you can see right here that this is the address that he has seen for the old MacBook, right? So the new MacBook is gone. It's been unplugged. So let's go ahead and bring this port back up. So I'll type in, I'm going to unplug the old MacBook, and we're going to plug the new MacBook in here. And so we should see a console message telling us, or actually we are not, the port is shut down. I apologize. All right, so I've now rectified the situation. The new MacBook with that MAC address, this guy has been plugged back into FA01. We don't see anything because the port is in a shutdown state. So if I were to say show port security, what's going on, right? We've got a security violation count of 1 here. And if I were to say show port security interface FA01, you can see that what is the status, the port status is, it is shut down right now, right? And so that's not good. And again, if I did just show port security, you can see all of the interfaces. Okay, that have port security enabled, I should say. All right, so we're going to go back into global config mode. I'm going to go into interface FA01, and now I'm going to say no shut, because I want to bring that interface back up now that we've fixed the problem, or I'm sorry, shut no shut. Now that we've fixed the problem and we've plugged in the correct PC. And so there you go, the interface now has changed to up. Let me go ahead now and let's do a show port security. Whoops. So we're going to say do show port security. All right, so the violation count, there is not a violation there. We've got 1 address, we've got 1 is the maximum number of addresses that we can have on that port. Let's do a show, oops, sorry. So we'll say do show port security on FA01. See what it looks like now. And you can clearly see that the port status is now in a secure up state. So again, the last source address, it's still showing when it had the violation, showing the address from the violation. It's not showing the address that's currently in there. So if I were to say do show run interface FA01, right, there is the sticky address that it's learned, and that's the address it's always going to be looking for. So if I said show, sorry about that, let's end out of here. So if I said show port security address, right, so here's where we're at. It's secure sticky. That's the port, the MAC address, and the VLAN. So one thing that we want to take a look at here is the situation where there are a couple of different violation modes. So remember, if the maximum number of MAC addresses has been exceeded, that's going to cause a violation like we just saw. Now, this is one that is, for new learners, can sometimes be confusing. So remember that an address that has already been learned on a secure interface, if that address, that MAC address, shows up on another secure interface in the same VLAN, that is also a violation. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and move on the switch from port FA01, the connection that we have right now. So if I were to say show MAC address table, so I'm going to move this connection from FA01, I'm going to place it into FA02, and let's see if in fact when we do that, this MAC address that has already been learned on a secure port in VLAN 1, will it cause a violation when it gets placed into another secure port, FA02, which is also in VLAN 1. And so there's going to be a, I'm not going to stop the recording because I want it to capture what it shows on the screen here, but I do need to step away, probably take about 10 to 15 seconds to make the switch, and then I'll be right back. So stand by. All right, so the port has been changed. One thing we did not do on those ports, which I'm going to do right now, interface range FA02 to 24, is say spanning tree port fast to make sure that comes up, transitions into the forwarding state right away. Okay, so port FA02, nobody was plugged into that port. That port had not learned any MAC addresses. And it had a maximum of 1, and all we did was move our connection from FA01 over into FA02, and immediately we get a port security violation error detected, right? Caused by MAC address 63A Alpha Delta, Delta 918. And so the reason for this is because, again, that MAC address had already been learned on a port. And so this prevents people from coming in and switching connections around when port security is on. Because if you go from one port with port security where your MAC has already been learned and you transition into another port that has port security configured, it's going to drop that port down into a down state. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Let's say show port security now, and what do we see? We now see that we have a security violation on port FA02. And so to trim down the output there, if I said show port security interface FA02, let's take a look, right? So port security is enabled. Now it's in the secure shutdown state. That's the last source MAC that it's seen, and we have a security violation count of 1. Now, the port is in a shutdown state. So if I say show run interface FA02, you'll notice that even though sticky learning is on, it did not learn that MAC address. And the reason is because the violation supersedes the learning of that MAC with respect to placing it here in the running config as part of the port security configuration. And it makes sense, right? It's an order of operations thing, because the MAC address had already been learned on a port where port security was already on. So by definition, when we move it, that port, it's just going to, FA02 is going to go into a shutdown state, because that MAC address that we see right here above us, that MAC address has already been learned on another port. So it can't show up on multiple ports. So if that's true, what we're about to do should also work. So I'm going to unplug the new MacBook, which ends in Delta 918. And so I've just pulled it out of port FA02, and I'm going to switch the connection on the laptops over to, I'm sorry, the new MacBook I've just unplugged. I'm going to switch the connection over to a different MacBook. We're going to switch it over to the old MacBook that ends in 60 Alpha Delta. Now, you'll notice we don't see anything, and why not? Because the port is shut down. So here's what I need to do. I need to go into Global Config. We're going to type in interface FA02. I'm going to say shut, no shut. And this is going to bring that interface up. And when it comes up, it's not going to see the MAC address that's already been learned. It's going to see this quote-unquote old MacBook MAC address, which for this port is new. So now if I say do show run, we're going to take a look here. So there's FA01, and FA01 is expecting the new MacBook to be connected. When we connected it to FA02, because it had already been learned here, that port got shut down. Let's take a look at FA02 though, now that we've disconnected the new MacBook and I've plugged in the old MacBook. What MAC address do you think would show up? And I'll wait here a second to let you think about it. Which MAC address is going to show up here? And if you said the old MacBook MAC address, you are correct. Because remember, even though we had plugged this in to port FA01 here, that was it resulted in a violation. So it's not going to learn this MAC address and place it in the MAC address sticky section here, because we've already learned one, and we have a maximum of 1, right? Maximum of 1 address is allowed on this port. So when I switch the connections and I put the old MacBook down here on FA02, FA02 had never learned another Mac. And that MAC address had never been set via sticky on another port. Therefore, this is going to work, right? So if I were to go ahead and say show port security to get a quick look here, you can see that our violation count has cleared. So current address count on FA01, we have 1. On FA02, yeah, we have 1. Sorry about that. I was going to say 2. So now I'm going to go ahead and do a show port security on interface FA02. What do we see? The port status is secure up. Violation mode is shut down. And now he shows the last address as not the one that he had previously had the violation with, which would have been the new MacBook address. He's actually seen the correct old MacBook Mac. And how many sticky Macs has he learned? 1. So what if we run that same command on FA01? You'll notice it doesn't look like the last source address here is changing, because he had already learned the previous address. And it's down. You'll notice it's not shut down, it's just down because, again, I've disconnected the cable. So we've got a chance to look at 3 different port status messages as well. Secure up, secure down, and down just means that the cable's not there, or for whatever reason the connection's down. And shutdown means that there has been a violation, and that is why the port is down. If I said show interface FA02 status, there's our status. We're connected, VLAN 1, and everything looks great, right? How about if we run that on 01? Back up here. On FA01, what does it say? It just says not connected, right? Because there's nothing connected to the port because we had to move the cable. Okay, so let's go ahead and from here, we're going to step back to our exercise, right? So we really took an in-depth look here at which port security command enabled that feature, right? It was Switchport Port-Security, Switchport. By default, we've got one MAC address that's allowed. Sticky's not on here, as we saw in our configuration when I did that show run. And again, that's where it can be a little misleading. So let's see what it says here. It says enable the port using the necessary commands. So we're going to go from privilege exec into global config, and I'm going to go ahead and say interface FA01, and I'm going to say shut, no shut. Now you'll notice that the interface state changed to up, and spanning tree is definitely going to run there. How about if I were to say spanning tree port fast? Maybe it'll let me get away with that. There we go. Okay, good. So, and now the switch has the port has transitioned to the forwarding state. It says verify connectivity. PC1 should now be able to ping PC2, and they don't have an address there for us. All right. So, again, what if I said do show run right now? So you'll notice the only command that's on there is the spanning tree port fast command. So if you were to look at this config in the real world and someone said, is port security on this port? The answer is no, it is not, because you don't have the Switchport Port-Security command there. Oh, and it's a dynamic port. So there's a number of things that are misleading here with this exercise. Because it's not an access port, so you can't even turn port security on. So then this begs the question, how was it that there was a violation that ever occurred here, right? So again, we actually got a chance to take a look at what a real Cisco switch is going to do. We hooked up two different MacBooks. We took a look at the protect, restrict, and shutdown modes. We talked about some very critical concepts, the difference between the secure MAC address types. Static secure MAC address is where I type in Switchport Port-Security MAC, and then I actually type in the exact MAC address that's going to be allowed. And then there's dynamic secure MAC addresses. So if I just plug the system in and port security's on that port, that is a dynamic secure MAC address because it's being learned dynamically. It's not being statically defined. And then finally, we had the sticky secure MAC address. And what that's going to do is the MAC address is going to be, it can be, dynamically learned or manually configured. But it's sticky, and the key word there is sticky, which means it's going to stick it in the running config. And if I save that running config, and so here's our final test here. So that actually brings up one last good test. So remember, sticky says it puts it in the running config. So if I say write mem, write memory, which is going to save my running config to the startup config, is it going to be persistent across switch reboots? And so this is an important concept here. So I've saved my running configuration, and now I'm going to say reload. And we're going to let the switch reload here. We're going to get logged back in, and we're going to check to see, did in fact the switch keep the sticky learned addresses in the running config? And do the systems on port FA01 and FA02 come back up? So again, we talked about dynamic secure MAC addresses, which if you're not doing sticky and you're not statically defining it, that's dynamic, right? Static is we do the Switchport Port-Security MAC address, and I type the MAC address in, and sticky just basically says, hey, if it's if it's statically defined, or if somebody just plugs something in, however it's done, I'm going to learn that MAC address and I'm going to put it into the running configuration. And if the running configuration is saved, when you reboot and the switch comes back up, and we're going to press return to get started here, we should probably see, and there we go, FA02 is now in the up state, right? So I'm going to type enable to get the privileged exec from user exec, and let's say show run. And what do we see? We had static definitions on FA01 and 02, and sure enough, even with nothing plugged into Fast Ethernet 01, the MAC address is still there because, again, that is sticky. We talked about the violation modes, protect, restrict, and shutdown, where shutdown literally shuts the port down. Protect and restrict simply drop the traffic, but the key differentiator between protect and restrict is that restrict is going to send a notification message that a violation has occurred. Protect is not going to send a violation. And last but not least, we looked at how do we bring a port from an air-disabled state back to an operational state. The number one requirement is that we have the correct MAC address plugged into that port. The next requirement is that we go into global config and then into interface config. And so I'll say conf t to get into global config, interface FA01, where we would say shut and then no shut. And as long as the MAC address is correct, that's going to bring the port back up for us. And then we talked about some commands that we can run. We can do, and let me actually get out of the interface config, I can do show port security, and that's going to show me the status for every port where port security is enabled. I could type in show port security interface FA02. If I just wanted to see the status of an individual port, I could type in show run interface FA02, and that's going to show me the current configuration on the interface. I could say show port security address, and there we go. So here's our two ports. They're both in the same VLAN, right? They're on FA01 and FA02. And how are they being learned? Secure, sticky, or what type are they? Secure, right? But they're sticky. And then there are the MAC addresses. If I were to type in show interface FA02 status, we can also see just simply the status of the port that it is connected. If I did FA01, right, remember we're going to see not connected. And if I were to say show port security interface, we may have already run this one, 02. Yeah, we already ran that. So again, you know, a whole host of tools that you can put now into your port security toolbox to give you a lot more flexibility and to really increase the security that you have on your switch. So again, this could be the 22410 is a little misleading, right? In how they're kind of portraying. I mean, obviously, they don't have us do any configuration work, but if you're poking around and you're using some of those commands from Chapter 2 and you're not seeing what you would expect to see, this can kind of get a little confusing. So hopefully, by taking a look at a real Cisco switch with two real physical hosts, these two MacBooks that we were using, you've got a much better idea as to how port security on a Cisco switch works. All right, well, this concludes PacketTracer Activity 2.2.4.10, and I really hope that you guys have a much better understanding than you did, much better understanding of the switch port security than you did before you watched the video. So I appreciate your time. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys soon.